The chamber was lit only by the flicker of fire, its glow dancing across stone walls blackened with soot. In the center stood a furnace, its mouth roaring, feeding on logs until iron rods within burned red as blood. A crowd gathered in hushed anticipation, their breath steaming in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the trembling figure forced to step forward. She was told to grasp the glowing iron, to walk 3 measured paces with it clutched in her hand. If her wounds healed in 3 days, she would be declared innocent. If not, she was guilty, marked forever as a servant of evil. But what happened in these ordeals revealed far more about man's cruelty than God's judgment. Stay with me, because this tale will scorch your imagination, and before we begin, hit subscribe if you dare to follow us deeper into history's darkest flames. The ordeal by hot iron was one of the most feared trials of the Middle Ages, a ritual shrouded in religious justification, yet dripping with human cruelty. Priests blessed the glowing bars, invoking divine will to guide the outcome. Judges claimed the fire would not harm the innocent, that God himself would shield the pure from pain. Yet every scream, every blister, every scar told another story, one where faith was twisted into an instrument of control. To understand why such a trial existed, we must return to an age where fear ruled. Plague stalked the land, famine hollowed bellies, and whispers of witchcraft spread like wildfire. Communities longed for answers, for certainty, for proof of who was guilty of bringing misfortune. And so, superstition was forged into law. The ordeal promised truth, but only by turning the human body into a battlefield between innocence and fire. The accused were rarely nobles or powerful men. They were women alone, widows without protection, healers whose knowledge made them suspicious, or anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the crossfire of jealousy and rumor. Their fate was decided not by reason, but by the heat of metal pressed into flesh. And when the iron kissed skin, it left behind not only scars, but judgments that could never be erased. One of the earliest accounts tells of a healer in Saxony accused of poisoning cattle. She was forced into the church before dawn, the furnace already blazing. The iron glowing bright was placed in her hand as chants echoed through the chamber. Witnesses said the smell of her flesh burning filled the air so sharp it clung to their hair and clothes. She staggered 3 steps, dropped the iron, and collapsed. 3 days later, when her wounds festered, the court declared her guilty. She was executed, her screams swallowed by fire once again. Imagine the sensation, the searing heat seeping instantly into the palm, pain exploding through every nerve, the sound of flesh sizzling like fat on a pan. The accused often fainted, their bodies convulsing on cold stone floors. Yet judges insisted this was holy truth revealed, that God had spoken through. Priests claimed the ordeal had divine precedent, citing scripture to justify the flames. They declared that saints had walked unharmed through fire, that true believers would be spared. But history shows no miracles here, only bodies broken, families ruined, and fear spread wider with every trial. The church that preached mercy now stood watch as fire consumed the innocent, sanctifying the crackle of burning skin as holy proof. One account describes a young man accused of theft dragged into the church while his family wept outside. He was forced to carry a red-hot iron across the nave, his screams echoing off vaulted ceilings. He dropped it within 2 steps, his palm already shredded. The crowd gasped, not at his suffering, but at the evidence of guilt they believed they had witnessed. 3 days later, his wound showed signs of infection. He was hanged before the same crowd that had demanded his trial. The aftermath of these trials was often worse than the ordeal itself. Victims, even if they miraculously survived with cleaner wounds, were rarely free from suspicion. Communities whispered behind their backs, unwilling to believe that God had truly spared them. They became marked people, shunned their innocence, doubted forever. In this way, the ordeal left not only scars on the body, but also on the soul, burning away trust, safety, and dignity. For the authorities, however, the ordeal was a convenient weapon. It created the illusion of divine judgment while silencing dissent. Anyone who questioned its fairness risked accusation themselves. Villagers learned to nod, to watch, to stay silent as neighbors were led into chambers of fire. The smell of burned flesh became routine, the screams background noise, the system too terrifying to resist. And so the furnace roared on, consuming not only hands, but entire communities in its flames. The iron ordeal was not always a simple grasp of the bar. In some regions, the accused were forced to walk barefoot across a path of glowing plowshares laid out in a line. The searing metal hissed as skin met heat, and each step was a battle between instinct to flee and the terror of appearing guilty by refusal. Witnesses described the screams echoing for miles, the smell of burning flesh clinging to the air long after the ordeal had ended. And yet villagers still whispered that if the blisters healed quickly, it was proof of innocence. These trials often began with rituals meant to cloak them in sanctity. The iron was blessed, sprinkled with holy water, and carried in solemn procession to the altar. Priests chanted prayers, their voices rising above the crackle of fire. But beneath this pageantry lay a grotesque truth: no blessing could change the nature of fire. Heat burned all the same, no matter how many verses were spoken. The spectacle turned suffering into a public performance and pain into theater. A chilling account survives from Hungary, where a young widow accused of witchcraft was ordered to retrieve a stone from a cauldron of boiling water. Her hand, already blistering, trembled as she reached in. Witnesses later recalled the skin peeling away in strips, the cauldron hissing as her flesh met the bubbling liquid. She withdrew the stone, screaming only to collapse. Within days, her wounds festered and the court declared her guilty. Her body, once proof of her humanity, had been turned into evidence against her. These ordeals relied on time as much as fire. After the trial, the victim's wounds were wrapped and sealed by priests who declared they would be examined after 3 days. But this waiting period was itself a torment, 3 days of fever infection and unbearable pain. Families sat helpless as loved ones writhed, knowing that no matter how the wounds looked, judgment had already been decided. Innocence or guilt mattered less than the spectacle of submission. The cruelty of the ordeal by hot iron lay in its inevitability. Science we now understand tells us burns always blister, always scar, and often infect. But in the Middle Ages, the line between natural consequence and divine will was deliberately blurred. Judges used infection as proof of guilt, clean healing as proof of innocence, but often both outcomes were twisted to fit the narrative they desired. The accused were never truly free. The fire's verdict was written before the flames were lit. Communities learned to fear the sound of iron being dragged from the furnace. Children clung to their mothers, men looked away, but none dared to speak. The ordeal was meant not only to punish, but to remind all who watched that power rested in the hands of priests and judges. The glowing iron was more than a tool. It was a symbol, one that silenced doubt and enforced obedience through terror. Occasionally, stories surfaced of miraculous survival. A young girl in Bohemia was said to have carried the iron without blistering her hand, remaining smooth and unscarred. Villagers proclaimed her innocence, declaring it a sign of divine favor. Yet others whispered that the iron had been cooled before the trial, that her family had bribed the priests. Even miracles could not escape suspicion in an age when faith and corruption walked hand in hand. The ordeal also left psychological scars. Survivors often bore hands twisted by burns, fingers fused together, or permanent disfigurement. They lived not only with pain, but with shame marked forever as those who had once stood accused. Some withdrew into silence. Others fled their villages, unable to bear the stares of neighbors. The fire had judged them, and even survival could not erase its brand. Over time, dissenting voices began to grow louder. A few priests admitted in secret that the ordeal was flawed, that God's will could not be measured by blisters. Chroniclers recorded doubts in margins of manuscripts, noting that those of higher rank or wealth seemed to fare better, their wounds healing miraculously, while peasants nearly always perished. The whispers of corruption spread, sowing seeds of suspicion that the ordeal was less divine than human. Yet for centuries, the furnace fires continued to burn. In towns and villages across Europe, the ordeal by hot iron claimed countless lives, reducing justice to ash and scar tissue. Each trial reinforced the illusion of order, even as it consumed the innocent. And with every scream that echoed in those stone chambers, faith was twisted tighter around cruelty until the two became indistinguishable. The system endured not because it was just, but because fear made it unbreakable. In some regions, the ordeal by hot iron was reserved for accusations so severe that ordinary punishment seemed insufficient: sacrilege, treason, witchcraft. The higher the crime, the more elaborate the ritual. Chronicles describe nobles gathered in cathedrals, their faces lit by firelight as an accused villager carried a glowing bar down the aisle. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hiss of skin against metal. For those watching, it was not just a trial, it was theater, a grim performance meant to satisfy both justice and spectacle. A notorious case from 11th century Germany tells of a blacksmith accused of conspiring with pagans. The irony was cruel. The man who had forged weapons for lords was forced to carry the very element he knew best. Witnesses said he held the iron with steady hands, but within hours his palms were swollen and blackened. On the third day, infection had set in. Declared guilty, he was executed. His trade tools melted down to forge more irons for future ordeals. The logic behind these ordeals was not only religious, but political. For rulers and priests, they offered a way to display power that seemed unquestionable. After all, who could argue with fire? The iron left marks that no one could deny. By claiming that God directed which wounds healed and which festered, authorities masked human corruption with divine authority. The flames became a convenient curtain hiding greed, vengeance, and fear behind a veil of holiness. Crowds played their part too. Villagers flocked to watch, treating the ordeal as both punishment and entertainment. Vendors sold bread and ale outside churches, children perched on fences to glimpse the glowing iron. The smell of smoke and burning flesh mingled with roasting meat from nearby stalls, blurring horror and festivity. In these moments, justice became carnival and cruelty became routine. One haunting testimony comes from a soldier who witnessed an ordeal in France. He wrote, "She walked 3 steps, her hand clenched white around the glowing rod. The sound was not of iron but of flesh crackling as if it were parchment in the fire. When she dropped it, the chamber filled with silence broken only by her sobbing. They called it judgment, but I saw only murder sanctified." His words, preserved in a faded journal, offer a rare glimpse of conscience in a time when silence was safer than truth. The ordeal was sometimes combined with fasting, adding layers of torment. Accused men and women were starved before facing the iron, their weakened bodies less able to endure pain or resist infection. Priests claimed fasting purified the soul for judgment, but in practice it stacked the trial against the accused. The hungry, the frail, the sick, all were doomed before the iron ever touched their skin. A particularly cruel variation forced women to carry the iron across consecrated ground while barefoot. Stones cut their feet as heat seared their hands, each step leaving blood in their wake. Villagers whispered that the path itself became cursed, that no grass grew where the accused had walked. Even the earth, they said, bore witness to the cruelty of man. In England, royal courts sometimes used the ordeal by hot iron to settle disputes of land and inheritance. One chronicler recounts how 2 families feuding over property sent their representatives to undergo the trial. The woman chosen carried the iron across the nave, collapsing after her second step. Her wounds festered and her family lost the land. Property and power shifted not by truth, but by the blistering of flesh. Over time, skeptics began to notice these patterns. The poor, the powerless, the isolated, they were the ones whose wounds always seemed to rot. Wealthier, accused those with connections to priests or lords often emerged with miraculously clean healing. Doubt grew. Could it be that God favored the rich? Or was it men's hands, not divine will, that determined the verdict? These whispers of suspicion gnawed at the ritual's sanctity, though few dared to speak them aloud. Yet for every skeptic, there were dozens who clung to the ordeal, terrified of what it would mean if it were false. To admit the fire lied was to admit that countless lives had been destroyed for nothing. And so the furnaces kept burning, the irons kept glowing, and victims kept screaming because belief was safer than doubt, and silence was easier than truth. The ordeal by hot iron also found its way into monasteries, where disputes among monks or accusations of heresy were sometimes settled in fire. One chronicle describes a young novice forced to grasp a glowing rod after being accused of secretly practicing forbidden rituals. He was said to have cried out for the Virgin to save him as he staggered down the nave, the iron burning through his skin. 3 days later, his wounds were declared infected, and he was cast out to die alone in the woods. His story became a whispered warning within cloisters. The fire spared no one, not even the pious. In Scandinavia, legends grew around those who endured the ordeal and survived. A saga tells of a woman who held the iron without flinching, her hands miraculously unscarred. Villagers proclaimed her chosen by the gods, though priests quickly silenced the tale, fearing it undermined their control. In truth, some records suggest that priests cooled the iron for select individuals, ensuring their innocence. It was not miracles that spared them, but manipulation hidden behind holy robes. The psychological toll of these ordeals rippled outward. Families of the accused often lived under suspicion, neighbors avoiding them as if guilt were contagious. Children of the condemned carried shame into adulthood, their names blackened by association. One man wrote in his will, "I die not of fire, but of silence, for none will break bread with my sons." The ordeal scorched not only skin but entire bloodlines. Over time, corruption became impossible to ignore. Chroniclers noted that nobles often escaped unscathed while peasants bore the brunt of the flames. Judges profited from confiscated property, priests accepted bribes, and outcomes began to reflect wealth more than supposed innocence. Some villagers began to mutter openly that the fire judged pockets, not souls. But fear still held them back, for to denounce the ordeal was to risk being tested by it themselves. One chilling account from Italy describes a woman named Caterina accused of bewitching a local merchant's crops. She was forced to carry the glowing iron across the church floor, her screams echoing as she stumbled. After 3 days, her wounds appeared to heal cleanly, yet the judges declared them infected anyway. She was executed, and her land was seized. It became clear that the ordeal was never truly about divine truth, it was about power and profit. The sensory details of these ordeals are almost unbearable to imagine. The roar of the furnace, the glow of the iron in dim light, the hiss as it met flesh, the acrid stench of burning skin filling the chamber until villagers gagged. Survivors sometimes described their vision going black, the world collapsing into sound and pain. One woman later whispered, "The iron did not test me, it consumed me." Despite the brutality, belief in the ordeal persisted because it offered certainty in an uncertain world. In an age without science, infection seemed like divine proof. If wounds festered, it was easier to accept God's judgment than to understand the natural cruelty of burns. Communities craved clarity, and the iron gave them an answer even if it was always the same pain. Yet cracks in the system widened as more clergy voiced doubts. A bishop in France recorded that he refused to oversee further ordeals, declaring God's justice is not measured in blisters. His stance shocked his peers, but it echoed the growing unease within the church. If priests themselves began to question how long could the fire maintain its authority, by the 12th century, councils convened to debate the ordeal. Some leaders argued it degraded the church, that it confused superstition with faith. Others defended it fiercely, insisting that without such trials, justice would collapse into chaos. The debates raged, but outside the council halls, furnaces still roared and irons still burned flesh. Change was slow, and victims continued to suffer while power clung to its fiery weapon. Eventually, reform came not from compassion, but from pragmatism. The ordeal drained communities, consumed resources, and left too many scars. As legal systems grew more complex, rulers found less need for fiery rituals. Slowly, decrees outlawed the practice, replacing it with written testimony and evidence. But by then, the iron had already left its mark on countless bodies, on generations of families, and on history itself, burned deep into its pages. When the ordeal by hot iron was finally banned in many regions, relief did not erase memory. Survivors bore their scars like brands, physical reminders of a system that had devoured them. Some became beggars, stretching out burned hands in silent testimony of their suffering. Others withdrew from their communities, entirely unable to live among those who had watched in silence as fire consumed their flesh. Villages carried the ordeal in their folklore long after the furnaces were extinguished. Parents warned children not to lie, whispering that liars would one day be forced to carry the burning bar. Lakes, rivers, and forests where victims were executed after their trials became sites of ghost stories. People claimed to see pale figures with blackened hands reaching out from the darkness, forever grasping for the iron that had sealed their fate. In cathedrals, some priests tried to erase the memory. They rebuilt altars where the trials had once been staged, painting over scorch marks on stone floors. Yet whispers endured. Parishioners swore they could still smell burned flesh during evening prayers, a scent that clung to the walls no matter how much incense was lit. The church that had once sanctified the ordeal could not fully cleanse itself of its smoke. Artists of the Renaissance reimagined the ordeal as a subject of horror and pity. Paintings showed trembling figures clutching glowing rods, saints watching impassively from stained glass above. Playwrights wove tragedies in which heroines were consumed by fire, not because they were guilty, but because society demanded sacrifice. Art turned what had been law into memory, exposing cruelty through brushstroke and verse. Historians later pored over court records, searching for patterns. They discovered that entire communities had been shaped by the ordeal, land redistributed after executions, families erased from property rolls, villages depopulated by fear. Each trial was more than a test of one person. It was a redistribution of power. Behind the glow of iron lay motives of greed and control hidden beneath the veil of faith. Psychologists studying trauma point to the ordeal as an early example of systemic cruelty disguised as justice. The accused were forced into impossible choices: grasp the iron and risk death, or refuse and confirm guilt. The system ensured suffering regardless of outcome, teaching entire societies that pain equaled truth. This conditioning lingered for centuries, shaping how people viewed authority and obedience. Folklore carried subtle rebellions, too. In some tales, the iron ordeal was inverted. Trickster figures carried the bar unharmed, outwitting priests and judges. These stories, passed in whispers, offered villagers a way to imagine resistance when reality offered none. They were fantasies of justice, fragile sparks of hope in an age dominated by fire. By the Enlightenment, scholars condemned the ordeal as barbaric, citing it as proof that superstition corrupts justice. They wrote treatises mocking the idea that infection revealed guilt, pointing to medicine and science as better guides. But even as they denounced it, they acknowledged its power and institutions so deeply rooted in fear that it had endured for centuries against reason. The legacy of the ordeal by hot iron lingers even in modern times. Phrases like trial by fire echo its origins, reminding us how deeply the ritual burned into cultural memory. Though today it means a difficult initiation or test, its roots lie in real screams, real scars, and real injustice. Language itself carries embers of the furnace, and so the story of the hot iron ordeal remains more than a curiosity of history. It is a warning. It reveals how easily cruelty can be cloaked in ritual, how pain can be dressed as truth, how silence can make accomplices of entire communities. The furnaces are long cold, but their lessons still glow. They remind us that whenever justice demands suffering as proof, we risk igniting the same fire again. Even after the formal bans, echoes of the ordeal by hot iron appeared in isolated regions where superstition held sway. Local lords, defying decrees, ordered secret trials to settle disputes. Chronicles tell of peasants forced into barns at night where glowing rods were pressed into their palms by candlelight far from the eyes of royal officials. Though outlawed, the ritual lingered in the shadows, its embers smoldering long after the law had declared them dead. Generations later, villages still bore the scars of those hidden trials. Some families refused to till certain plots of land, claiming the soil itself was cursed because it had been won through fire. Others left offerings at old furnaces as though appeasing spirits of the burned. Memory outlasted legality, haunting communities that had been built on smoke and screams. Folklorists in the 19th century recorded chilling songs sung by shepherds and farmers, laments passed from mouth to mouth. One refrain whispered, "Her hands were ash, her name erased, but fire remembers." These verses were not written in official histories, but they carried truths more enduring than decrees. In song and story, victims who had been silenced found a voice that could not be extinguished. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of scorched stone floors, iron bars fused with rust and char, even bones with burn patterns that suggest the hand had been seared while alive. These relics transform chronicles into reality, proving that the ordeal was not metaphor, but flesh, not legend, but lived torment. Each artifact is a silent witness carrying the heat of centuries into the present. Modern scholars trace how ordeals like the hot iron shaped later systems of justice. The obsession with physical proof, scars, wounds, marks paved the way for forensic thinking, though born in brutality. What began as superstition eventually evolved into science, yet the cost was thousands of bodies sacrificed to the flames of ignorance. Justice, it seemed, had to burn before it could learn. Psychological research compares the ordeal to modern forms of coercion. The same logic survives in systems where pain is mistaken for truth, where confessions are forced through suffering, where silence is twisted into guilt. The ordeal by hot iron is not only history, it is a mirror showing that the mechanisms of cruelty adapt but rarely disappear. Some churches have since acknowledged their role, placing memorial plaques in towns where ordeals once burned. In solemn ceremonies, names of the accused are read aloud, their innocence declared centuries too late. The irony is, sharp voices silenced by fire are now echoed by bells of repentance. These acts cannot undo the past, but they mark a step toward remembering rather than erasing. The ordeal's legacy also lingers in language. To grasp the iron survives as a metaphor for facing terrible trials, while trial by fire carries echoes of blisters and screams beneath its modern meaning of challenge. Every time the phrase is spoken, a shadow of the furnace flickers, reminding us of origins forged in pain. Films and literature often reimagine the ordeal, dramatizing the moment when trembling hands stretch toward glowing metal. Directors linger on the silence before the scream, the unbearable weight for judgment, the weight of the community's gaze. Audiences watch with horror yet fascination, just as villagers once gathered centuries ago. Art keeps the ordeal alive, not to glorify but to confront. What remains most haunting is not the fire itself, but the silence of those who watched. Neighbors who did not intervene, priests who blessed the rods, judges who twisted outcomes, all became accomplices. The ordeal thrived not only on flames, but on collective compliance. And so its warning is clear: whenever communities remain silent in the face of cruelty, the furnace roars again, waiting for another hand to burn. The silence of the witnesses was perhaps the ordeal's greatest cruelty. People gathered in churches and courtyards, pretending to believe in divine justice while their neighbor's flesh was consumed. They convinced themselves it was God's will, though in truth it was fear that bound their tongues. The furnace did not only burn hands, it burned away courage, teaching entire societies that obedience mattered more than mercy. Some rare voices defied the ritual, standing against the tide of terror. A monk in Flanders wrote openly that the ordeal was a trick of men, not a voice of God. For this, he was exiled, stripped of his title, and nearly executed. His courage was erased from official histories, but fragments of his writings survived in hidden libraries. His words prove that even in the darkest ages, doubt flickered like a fragile flame. As ordeals faded, inquisitions rose, replacing fire in the hand with fire on the body. Torture chambers spread across Europe, and though the rituals changed, the logic remained. Suffering was proof, pain was truth. Screams were evidence. The ordeal by hot iron had ended, but its shadow stretched into new forms of cruelty, reminding us that injustice rarely dies, it evolves. The cultural trauma of centuries of ordeals lingers even today. Anthropologists argue that collective memory of fire and trial shaped Europe's distrust of authority and hunger for reform. The Enlightenment was not only born from reason, but also from revulsion, an entire continent scarred by centuries of watching innocence blister and burn. Progress grew from ash. The ordeal also shaped faith itself. Many believers, forced to watch neighbors consumed in holy rituals, began to question the institutions that claimed divine authority. Faith was not destroyed, but it was transformed, shifting from blind obedience to a search for personal truth. In this way, the fire that silenced voices also ignited revolutions of thought. In modern memorials, visitors often pause longest at displays of the hot iron rods themselves. The metal, once glowing red, now lies blackened and rusted in glass cases. But even cold, it radiates horror. To imagine it pressed into human flesh is to bridge centuries in an instant, to feel history not as distant, but as painfully close. Writers have called the ordeal a scar on civilization, a ritual that reveals the depths of cruelty humanity can sanctify when fear takes power. Its story is not one of isolated events, but of a system that thrived because communities allowed it. This is the lesson most difficult to face. The iron was wielded by few, but sustained by many. And so when we look back on the ordeal by hot iron, we are not only studying history, we are confronting ourselves. Would we have spoken out as the furnace roared? Would we have dared to save a neighbor as the iron seared her skin? Or would we too have watched in silence, convincing ourselves that suffering proved truth? These are questions the past forces upon us. The ordeal's relevance is not buried in medieval ash. Even today, systems exist where pain is mistaken for proof, where power hides behind rituals of authority, where silence makes accomplices of crowds. The iron may be cold, but its spirit flickers wherever cruelty is justified in the name of order. And so, as the last embers of this story fade, we are left with its most haunting truth. The ordeal by hot iron was never about fire. It was about fear. Fear that silenced communities, fear that granted power to the cruel, fear that burned brighter than any flame. The rods are gone, the furnace is cold, but the warning remains. What fires of injustice burn around us now, and will we dare to extinguish them before they consume us all?